So my paper presentation is on U.S.-Soviet cooperation in P&Es, a kind of obscure chapter of Cold War history, but one that I think provides important insight. So what interested me the most when I was doing my research was ultimately the kind of bureaucratic level of analysis and the debate in the U.S. Bureaucracy on P&Es and how that affected cooperation with the Soviet Union. So I kind of drew three overarching points. Number one being that bureaucratic politics and the narrow interest of different departments often shape policy towards the Soviet Union as much as the broader national interest did. And so for this case study, the kind of main protagonists are State Department and ACTA on one side and the Atomic Energy Commission on the other. The second point that I drew that kind of flows directly from the first is that in order to produce coherent policy from this tangled mess of bureaucratic politics, administrations had to establish a kind of strict hierarchy of interest and a clearly defined national interest. As I saw in kind of my researching from the Limited Test Ban Treaty to the NPT, administrations had this tendency to patch together divergent bureaucratic positions into one policy, which often led to inconsistent positions and ultimately hampered cooperation with the Soviet Union. On the other hand, though, when there was kind of bureaucratic agreement and coordination amongst the different departments, cooperation was more finely tuned. There were clear-cut policies with which the Soviet Union could engage. And then lastly, which kind of draws from Sarah's discussion on ACTA and its role, it's very important to have kind of institutional advocates for stability and cooperation with the Soviet Union in terms of creating kind of long-term sustainable policies. And ACTA and kind of State Department, and at least in my case study, were those kind of institutional advocates. So as a brief overview of just P&Es, peaceful nuclear explosives, the U.S. created its program known as Plowshare in 1957. It was kind of the brainchild of the Atomic Energy Commission. They researched ideas such as excavation projects, building canals, stimulation of gas. Ultimately, the program kind of petered out in the mid-70s. The Soviet program started a little later in the mid-60s, and it ultimately surpassed Plowshares in terms of scope and industrial use. One kind of famous project, they diverted the Peshora River, so the Soviet Union ultimately actually used P&Es to a greater extent than the U.S. So my kind of the first episode in this narrative that I explored was the Limited Test Ban Treaty, which I thought was a kind of inflection point for U.S.-Soviet relations and P&Es. Now, signed in August 1963, the LTBT was the first significant arms control agreement between the U.S. and Soviet Union. But I also saw that it kind of forced, for the first time, into the open the U.S. bureaucratic debate on P&Es. And so in the lead up to the negotiations, Atomic Energy Commission Chairman Glenn Seaborg, who's pictured on the left, and also the kind of visionary of the Plowshare program, was worried that a test ban treaty would kind of hamper and constrain the Plowshare program and limit the projects it could pursue. And so kind of before negotiations started, Glenn Seaborg drew up a inspection regime and essentially a list of guidelines that would exempt P&Es pursuant to an annex under this treaty. So on the kind of eve of negotiations in Moscow, Kennedy convened an interagency meeting to go over the U.S. positions. This meeting for me was kind of an example of how bureaucratic priorities can clash and shape policy. So Seaborg's proposal of exempting P&Es under test ban became a kind of lightning rod in these talks. So in the meeting, Seaborg on one side, and then you kind of have William Foster and Adrian Fisher, as well as Secretary of State Dean Rusk on the other. So ACTA and State thought that the test ban treaty and P&E exemption were essentially mutually exclusive. They believed that exempting P&Es under a test ban would diminish the treaty's political and practical value to the point that it would essentially be useless. They also pointed that this inspection regime that Seaberg proposed would be a non-starter of the Soviet Union. So, proposing this would essentially scuttle the talks. Now, Seaberg's proposal kind of briefly won out. But I think this meeting, though, is an example of how kind of bureaucratic politics, and especially different agencies, can analyze issues in isolation. So you have Seaberg and the AEC willing to dilute a significant treaty and complicate negotiations with the Soviet Union to ensure the viability of its kind of pet project, Plowshare. On the other hand, you have ACTA and state that were intent on building a strong arms control and non-proliferation instrument, as well as easing tensions with the Soviet Union at the expense of this Plowshare's program that they really didn't care about. So you have Averell Harriman, who was the lead U.S. negotiator, delivered this draft treaty that included a section for Seaberg's annex to Soviet Foreign Minister Gromyko in July 1963. Now, there were only two kind of sticking points between the Soviet Union and U.S. On this draft treaty. It was the P&E exemption and a withdrawal framework. Now, as ACTA head William Foster and kind of Adrian Fisher had predicted, the Soviet Union refused to allow for a P&E exemption annex. So Averell Harriman, who kind of hailed from the State Department, made the judgment call that they could sacrifice the P&E exemption, using it as a bargaining chip to get a withdrawal clause, which the American administration viewed as essential for getting Senate ratification. So you kind of see here, the rationale behind Harriman's decision to kind of trade the P&E exemption for the withdrawal clause. And as it turns out, Kennedy was kind of quick to give Harriman the green light. The Soviets accepted the deal and agreed to put the withdrawal clause in while dumping the P&E exemption. I think the fact that the Kennedy administration was so quick to give up its fight for Plowshare in the negotiations suggests that it was never fully behind the AEC proposal and was always closer, leaning closer to the kind of ACTA position. Now, it's unclear if from the beginning it viewed Plowshare as a bargaining chip or it got lucky, but the original draft text delivered by Harriman represented a kind of half-baked combination of AEC and ACTA positions. So kind of what I talked about earlier, but the fact that the AEC kind of viewed Plowshare very narrowly, without respect to the U.S. administration's broader non-proliferation arms control agreement, shaped at least initially U.S. policy on P&Es. Whereas ACTA, perhaps in line with the broader national interests, was not willing to kind of sacrifice this opportunity to establish a test ban, in order to save kind of Plowshares. So kind of interestingly enough, U.S.-Soviet P&E cooperation truly began even before they signed the Limited Test Ban Treaty. So after Khrushchev and Harriman had finalized the LTBT text, Khrushchev invited Harriman to attend a U.S.-Soviet track meet in Moscow. It was kind of one of those scripted moments of history when, the nuclear arms race was briefly paused, so of course they watched an actual foot race. But while watching the track meet, Khrushchev tells Harriman of the Soviets' long-term plans for P&Es and believed that, in the future, the U.S. and Soviet Union could cooperate in this field. Now, as we've seen in other case studies, it's hard to overstate the significance of these personal interactions and relationships for cooperation. Kind of taking the track meet example and trying to apply that today, it's almost, one would have to almost kind of suspend disbelief if, Chris Ford were to go to Moscow to watch, the opening game of the World Cup, and during that game with Putin discuss, the extension of New START. That kind of example is an alternate universe, and it really demonstrates how much has changed since, Harriman and Khrushchev had this kind of informal, low-key discussion on the sidelines of the track meet to, an imaginary visit by Chris Ford to the opener in Moscow. So after this track meet, the gears of diplomacy kind of slowly turned, and cooperation on P&Es gradually emerged, which leads us to the second episode in this narrative, the NPT negotiations and the construction of Article 5. So whereas Seaberg and the AAC were obstacles to cooperation in the Limited Test Ban Treaty, soon after that treaty's establishment, at the outset of NPT talks in the ENDC, the 18-Nation Disarmament Commission, Seaberg became the main proponent of cooperation with the Soviet Union on P&Es. Seaberg was, actually very eager to begin talks with the Soviets, in particular about a new idea of his. He wanted to form an international service through which the U.S. and Soviet Union could provide P&Es to non-nuclear weapon states. Now, as impractical as it sounds now, at least from a bureaucratic standpoint, the idea was kind of a brilliant one because it represented a convergence of bureaucratic interests into one kind of neat package. So for the Atomic Energy Commission, this international service idea was a kind of economic lifeline. At the time, there was waning interest in the U.S. to use P&Es, so the AEC thought, to save this program, we can maybe sell these services abroad. For the State Department, this international service was a kind of, it would deepen engagement with the Soviet Union. It could also be a kind of source of positive linkage, a way to spur cooperation in other fields and ease tensions. Now for ACTA, this service was very helpful, or this idea was very helpful in its negotiations on the NPT in Geneva, because this service would, or this proposal of an international service was part of the kind of bargain where in denying P&Es for non-nuclear weapon states, the U.S. and Soviet Union would provide them, and which would kind of discourage proliferation of this technology. So kind of as a result of this bureaucratic alignment at the U.S. level, we see a kind of quick increase in U.S.-Soviet meetings. So, at the bilateral level, the State Department and kind of Dean Rusk in particular met frequently with Soviet Ambassador Dobrynin multiple times, kind of between 1965 and 1968, on this P&E idea. At the multilateral level, ACTA officials and the ENDC marketed the idea and also cooperated with Soviet officials as well in Geneva. So I think this is in stark contrast to what happened in the Limited Test Ban Treaty, where you had kind of bureaucratic disagreement that ultimately led to a kind of inconsistent position in the negotiations, to what we have here, where we see a kind of bureaucratic alignment, more clear cooperation with the Soviet Union, and a kind of firmer course of action. So to kind of wrap up the historical part and kind of draw these lessons for today, kind of to look at how bureaucracies play in the formulation of policy and how that's playing out in the Trump administration. It's always hard to kind of use the Trump administration as empirical evidence, but I think we're seeing a kind of warped, almost surreal version of bureaucratic politics. The traditional interagency process, where different departments provide inputs and a national security agency usually provides the output, has been replaced by a kind of royal court of advisors that make knee-jerk, uninformed decisions. So for relations with Russia, I think this new normal for bureaucratic politics and functions has had the greatest impact on arms control and strategic stability. So, since, we kind of talked about détente, but since Nixon and Kissinger's policy of détente, arms control has probably been the most accurate barometer of the health of U.S.-Soviet and U.S.-Russian relations. We've seen ups and downs over the administrations in terms of the practice of arms control, but I think in the Trump administration we're seeing kind of unprecedented institutional decay in terms of arms control. So kind of as we've seen in our case studies, the State Department and ACTA has now kind of been absorbed by the State Department, has been a longtime proponent of arms control in the U.S. bureaucracy. But under Trump, at least for the first year under Tillerson, the State Department was sidelined in major policy decisions. It played, I think, a very small part in the NPR. Even just at a kind of human capital level, there's been vacant, so essentially, here I kind of use the example of Rose Gottmuller and the position of Assistant Secretary of ISN. So Gottmuller was, of course, one of the chief architects of New START. That position, Assistant Secretary of ISN, is the kind of major player in the State Department for arms control. For 1 year, for the first year of the Trump presidency, it was vacant. It's now filled by Chris Ford, who, has shown his kind of disdain for Article 6 and disarmament, and as a kind of, he's a product of the Hudson Institute, which seems to value kind of nuclear warfighting over arms control measures. As another example, we have kind of the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, which was, previously held by Wendy Sherman, who was one of the chief architects of the JCPOA. That position is now empty. Tom Shannon was previously it, and he resigned. So that position, another key position for, political relations with the Soviet Union is now, with Russia, is now vacant. And then you have now, kind of John Bolton, who, he orchestrated the U.S. withdrawal from the ABM treaty, and he has shown open contempt for kind of arms control as a, policy. So I think.
Think of our virtual green, yellow, and red light now flashing yellow.
So I'll just finish up. Another point that I didn't really touch upon in my presentation, but I think is important for this kind of bureaucratic picture, is the role of Congress. So at least in the kind of Cold War, you had people like Hubert Humphrey, William Fulbright, who were kind of the standard bearers of arms control. They would press administrations to engage in talks with the Soviet Union. They would then kind of shepherd these agreements through the Senate for ratification. And now to kind of go to the present day, you see, lack of expertise, a lack of knowledge regarding these issues. And you have people like Tom Cotton who are, calling for a resumption of nuclear testing. So I guess I'll wrap up on that positive note.